Get on the train before it leaves the station. The truth train is coming, gonna run them down, run them down.
Hello everybody, how you doing? We're here today starting off a series of videos that I'm going to be doing here, where we are going to look at the evidence against Steven Avery. And we're going to look at the, both sides of it. Basically, the fact that the evidence is bad and does implicate Steven and does work against him. But also on the other side, where the evidence has a lot of questionable aspects to it. I think it's important to do it this way because I think there's a lot of people out there that prefer to see things presented in that way. I know I'm one of them. I prefer to see things presented in a way where you're kind of seeing it from both sides. I think it helps people make a more informed decision, to be honest. So the thing is I can also understand, because anybody that watched maybe the documentary, the original documentary, and maybe never went any further, didn't look into any documents or anything, could have an opinion that Steven is guilty. Because I myself, after watching the documentary, was on the fence about Steven. I was not sure. I had some problems. I had some issues. And they only went away with further research. Or at least I ended up falling on the side of there's too much stuff here for this to be a coincidence or just oops. It's just it piles up, and so but we'll get to that. But after watching the original documentary, I was not convinced about Steven, and I can understand how other people might feel that way. I know a lot of people, will bring up some of the stuff in his past. It's, not relevant to this case, but I can understand people looking at it and using it as a kind of a gauge, if you will. So I can understand how people who didn't dig in further to really see a lot of the improprieties, I could see how they could, have that opinion, and so that's why I wanted to go ahead and do this. I mean, you want to look at it from both sides and, and see it for, in full. So we're going to be starting today with the bones. This is going to be the first video. We're going to be also doing a video about the RAV, which is going to include the blood and all that sort of stuff. And then we're going to be doing one about the bullet. Okay, because these are all things that were used against Steven at trial. Okay, while we're talking about the RAV, we're going to be talking about the hood latch and those sort of things. Then we're going to be talking about the bullet, of course. And we're going to be talking about, some other pieces of evidence, things at trial that were used against Steven. And we're going to look at, yes, why they are bad and why they make it look as though Steven was involved. And then we're going to look at the aspects of those pieces of evidence that make you wonder, well, how did this even happen? How did this even get there? And the various questions that arise. But when we look at it, right on the surface, okay, we find that there are bones in the burn pit behind Steven Avery's garage. We know that. That's where they were found. That's about all that can be said. There's no detailed collection, and we'll get into that. But there's some there. But then there's also some over in a burn barrel, over at the Dassey residence. So there's some bones, some human bone determined to be Teresa's, in a burn barrel over by the Dassey residence. Okay, and then there's some piles of bones, basically two properties over, across one quarry into a second quarry. There are some piles of bones that were also deemed to have been burned to the exact same calcined nature as the bones that were in the fire pit and in the Dassey burn barrel that I just mentioned, right? Okay, now It was the testimony of the state's expert, the forensic anthropologist Leslie Eisenberg at trial, that she, from the burn barrel at the Dassey residence and the fire pit, she determined that she had a piece of at least a bone from every major part of the body. You know, so I'm not quite sure what that means. She doesn't say every bone of the body. She says from every part of the body. So it makes it seem like a more generalized way she's looking at a human body in the limbs, I guess, or something. But whatever. She claims that she has bones from all the main parts of the body, right? Or portions of bones from every major part of the body. And so that's, you know, that's part of the proof that it's Teresa Halbach in the burn pit and the burn barrel. And then the other part is the FBI, Agent LeBeau is his name. He testifies they did a mitochondrial DNA test on some I think it was a piece of flesh they found on one bone. And they did a mitochondrial DNA, and that they were able to determine that it was most likely. With mitochondrial DNA, it's really, really weird wording of the way they word things, but basically it was worded in the way that was positive, mostly that it was most likely Teresa. But with mitochondrial DNA, it's kind of tricky, and I've done some videos with Scooby about it. But mitochondrial DNA is a little bit tricky. It's a little bit different than our regular DNA, and the information that they glean from it is somewhat less perfect than a regular DNA test, where it tests for our own DNA instead of for the DNA inside of the mitochondria inside of our cells. The reason why mitochondrial DNA is a thing is because for every one cell in your body, there are anywhere from, I believe, Scooby said, 300 to 1,000 mitochondria associated with it. So that's why when blood deteriorates, they're more able to get, a profile from mitochondria, because there was just so much of it to begin with. There's a chance that they're going to find enough of those cells that haven't degraded completely yet to get, reading, to get a DNA result. So anyways, so we know that the FBI determined that the bones were Teresa's. So this is Teresa Halbach's bones in Steven Avery's fire pit. This is a very bad thing for Steven. This is very, I mean, if any of us ever found out that there was somebody's bones in our backyard, we'd all be going, whoa, uh-oh. You know what I mean? That would be pretty damning. And if you didn't do it, you're really going to be, you're going to really be beside yourself. You're going to be really distraught at trying to figure out how that happened to you, right? So that's certainly the case. And well, if you know how they got there, then well, you deserve what's coming. But anyway, it's a damning thing. Because it's hard for people to believe that somebody else would have put bones in your own burn pit, right? People aren't. It's not something people are really willing to, entertain. They don't think people are going to go around dumping people's bones in other people's burn pits and stuff. It's just not something that people are real common to believe. But the thing is that in this case, are all the bones in the burn pit where the prosecution claims is the primary burn site? Are all the bones there? No, they're not. Some of the bones are over in a burn barrel, over about 50 yards away from Steven's trailer, in a burn barrel over there. So they're not all together. So this is odd. But there they are. You have a lot of these bones, a significant portion, I'm going to say, because I'm about to show you some things about the testimony that are going to be interesting. But so you have these bones of the victim being found in proximity to Steven. They also know, and brought in a trial, that Teresa was there that day to photograph a van, a minivan. So they're also able to place her there that day, which is also very, very, looks very, very bad for Steven. Because, oh, this girl showed up at your house today to take pictures, and now nobody knows where she is. Right? It's not hard to understand how people just go, oh yeah, he's guilty. It's not hard to understand it. Because that's the way I was thinking about it at first too. But I was disturbed by the amount of impropriety that I saw in making a murderer. And so I felt like it deserved further, scrutiny. And so I ended up looking deeper. But the bones being in his burn pit and in that burn barrel are, yes, it's along with the fact that Teresa had an appointment to be there that day. All these things come together and are very convincing evidence against Steven. Okay. And then one other thing that was also helped in identifying Teresa, number one, in Steven Avery's fire pit, and that was the tooth that was reassembled. Okay, expert at trial, whose name escapes me at the moment, but the dental expert at trial, forensic dental expert, basically said he was able to glue two pieces back together and that it matched Teresa's tooth, or forget which number it was, but he basically said it was a match for one of Teresa's teeth based on her dental records. Okay, so this was also another thing, very, very bad, very much, implicating Steven Avery. Okay, so that's just one other thing to consider when we're talking about all of the bone evidence, because since technically teeth are bone, all the bone evidence against Steven Avery, it's considerable, and it's it certainly does work against Steven Avery. But now we'll start to talk about some of the reasons that the bones and the bone evidence really has issues. Now we're going to start talking about why there's issues with this. And number one, right off the bat, I want to say this right off the bat. You have the bones, which are pretty damning, but you have no indication of a crime scene. Some people are willing to believe in this fantasy that he could have cleaned it up. If you're one of those, okay, fine, fair enough. But there is no crime scene. Where did this happen? And oh yeah, and the thing we got from Brendan Dassey, yeah, that's just a mess and was mostly fed to him. So there's really not much to be gleaned there. We have no trace of Teresa anywhere else. At all. Anywhere. Except for one place. And that is a DNA hit they got on the bullet they ended up finding in the garage on March 3rd. When they went in to Steven Avery's garage again, they found this bullet under the compressor, right? And that had a profile on it. Not going to talk about that today, because that obviously is going to be covered in the video about the bullet, and you'll get to hear everything I have to say about that bullet, the DNA on it, all of it, right? Okay, so we'll just leave that for later. Other than that, you have, and the bones, you have no trace of Teresa Halbach. Zero. That's a problem. And that's just right off the bat. That's a problem. Because where did this all happen? And I don't believe he cleaned it up. For those of you who can believe that kind of fantasy, fine, but I don't believe that, and I just can't believe that. It's too far-fetched. Way too far-fetched. So, that's right off the bat. Then, we move into the finding of the bones. Well, let's first talk about this. Nobody reports a foul smell. And when you burn a body, a human body, or, well, even if it was an animal body. But humans are more fatty, so it's worse. But when you burn a body, it creates a horrible, very strong, overwhelming stench that is unmistakable and impossible to not notice. Okay? The problem is we don't have any report of that happening at Steven Avery's. We just don't have it. There's nobody that ever says that until Brendan says it. And that's because Tom Fassbender and Mark Wiegert suggest it to him. And because they're suggesting to him over and over again and asking him about a smell. Didn't you smell wasn't there a smell, Brendan? Blah, 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 and, you know, wasn't there a horrible smell? And eventually, after asking that many times, Brendan said something about a smell. And that's it. That's like all we got. There is a report of a foul-smelling fire, but it comes from about 4.5 miles north of Avery Salvage, and on November 1st instead of October 31st. So that's be what it is. That's the only report we have of a foul-smelling fire, foul enough to explain a body being burned. But it's on November 1st. And the bones were found on November 8th, right? November 8th is when they were discovered at the Avery property. Even though they were there on the 5th, they were not able to get Bear out of the way, who was chained up behind the garage. They were not able to get him out of the way, so they weren't able to collect those bones until the 8th. So that's just another interesting factoid there. A foul-smelling fire did occur, but it was 4.5 miles north of Avery Salvage, and on November 1st instead of October 31st. Okay. Next thing is we, after not having any foul-smelling fire that would explain a body being burned, we have the fact that when these bones were found on the 8th, it was not the first thought of the officers and the deputies who found it to immediately call their lead crime scene technician over to collect and photograph and everything, these bones properly. They just start tearing things up, and then eventually only call their lead crime scene technician because they want him to bring his sifting equipment. Like they may not have ever involved him at all if they didn't need him to bring the sifting equipment. Like that kind of, right? And you're gonna see right now, I'm gonna show you where the lead crime scene technician, his name is John Ertl, is going to say that no, we didn't take any photographs and document this at all, because by the time we got there, it had already been basically torn up, and things had been being ripped up and put on sifters and this and that or whatever. So basically he was like, there's nothing it was already beyond any pictures we would have taken at that time would have been of an area that had been dug up by multiple officers, basically. So they weren't able to do a detailed collection or or at least photograph things because they weren't called until later. Okay? Now, I'm going to go ahead and show you that right now, and then we'll come on back. Okay, so this is from the testimony of lead crime scene tech Ertl. And this is, I believe, Dean. And he says, and when you were called over to this burn area behind the garage, you didn't take any photographs then either, did you? And that's because the scene had been altered before you arrived. Isn't that right? To which Ertl says yes. So we know that the crime scene techs were not even, we're not even informed about this in a timely fashion. The first thing they hear of it is when they need help sifting. So the question that this always leaves me with is, why wouldn't you get your lead crime scene tech there immediately, right? Because why would you take a chance of your evidence being questionable? Why would you ever want to even do that? Why wouldn't you want a forensic anthropologist such as maybe the one that Deb Kakich, the Manitowoc County coroner, was going to bring with her? But she was barred from the investigation, or she was barred from the entire thing. But she was going to be bringing a forensic anthropologist with her, and they barred her. And then, you know, this here paints a clear picture that even their own lead crime scene tech was just an afterthought to them. Whatever they, you know, however this collection of the bones happened, there's some reason that they didn't want anybody to be able to document it in any way, shape, or form. Other than the few reports we get. They didn't take pictures. They didn't, you know, go into great detail about how these bones, you know, lay in the fire pit, which is important. Okay, all right. So now we're all on the page that they were these cremains in Steven Avery's burn pit were identified as Teresa, and now we're gonna get some specifics in terms of how much of the cremains did they find. And the reason why this is important is because when you call something a primary burn site and don't find a significant number or amount of the cremains there, and the parts and stuff off of the clothing, you know, like buttons and rivets, when you only find some rivets and don't find the waist button, these give cause or give rise to speculation that that was not the primary burn site. So we're going to go ahead and look at a bit of Leslie Eisenberg's testimony right here, and then we're going to come back and we're going to discuss the possibility that Steven Avery's burn pit was not the primary burn site. In fact, it seems likely that it wasn't the primary burn site. So, all right. So this is from the testimony of Dr. Leslie Eisenberg. She's being questioned by Dean Strang. And so he's going to be asking her here about how crematoriums usually calculate the conversion of a entire living body, and what volume, after it goes through the crematorium, what volume of that entire body will be left, in order, basically, how much material would be left over after the cremation. So that's what they're talking about here. So it says, as I did my quick calculations, if Miss Halbach's weight was, as it was stated on the missing persons poster, as 135 pounds, then in terms of volume, what would have been expected if we were able to identify every fragment as human and group them all together? The volume of her remains after the burning incident after cremation of sorts, if you will, would be a little larger than a 2-liter bottle of soda. And I say that with all due respect. No, I understand. A little bit more than 2 liters. To which Leslie Eisenberger says, correct. About 2.2 liters. So if you imagine, because of Teresa Halbach's weight at 135 pounds, the conversion says that her cremains should be able to come out to about 2.2 liters. Or be just a little bit more than enough to, you know, to fill up a 2-liter bottle. Okay? So, he says, for a person of about that weight, to which she says, correct. If, and then he's basically asking, and stature. And she says, the crematorium estimates for the weight to volume conversion is accurate. Right. And what you had here was substantially less than 2 liters of volume. I'd say probably I have 2 to 3/5 of what might be expected given those rough calculations. Okay, fair enough. So something perhaps, this is all very rough, but perhaps 2 to 3/5 is 40 to 60% of what might be a complete skeleton. And she says, correct. And Dean says, in total? And she answers, no. I'm sorry. That's not what I said. In terms of expected volume from human remains of the stated weight for Miss Halbach, yes. I believe if you filled or put those fragments into a 2-liter bottle, about 40% of the bottle would be filled. To which Dean says, okay. Now you understand she was saying 40 to 60% of what was expected, and you saw right there where she was going to say 40 to 60 again, but her own her own sensibilities informed her that she should just say 40%, because that's exactly what she did. 40% of that bottle would be filled. That means that's less than half of what should be there. That's less than half. So that's what they found in Steven Avery's burn pit. That's this primary burn site that you hear all this tell about, and it had less than half of the victim's cremains in it. So that's something to note. Okay, so this brings me to the next issue. That is that they only recovered 2/5 of what they should have recovered. Okay? Now, that's just bizarre. Okay? This is supposed to be the primary burn site. Right? And even if they take everything in the fire pit and everything in the Dassey burn barrel and put it together, they're only getting 2/5, less than half, 40%, less than half of what should be there. And something tells me the bones would probably be most of that 2.2 liters that they were talking about, because the bones are harder and denser and are made of more significant material, whereas flesh is just a loose network of cells that are puffed up by water. Once the water burns off, there's very little left there. Okay? So I got to imagine the primary amount of what you get in that 2.2 liter for a 135-pound person after cremation, right? You end up with which would be the equivalent of a 2.2 liter of, volume of bone, or, well, of cremains. Okay? I got to imagine the bone would be most of that, because like I said, the bone is more significant than flesh. Like I said, flesh is just a loose network of cells that are puffed up by water. Okay. So, that is just significant to me, that they only find that it's not even over half. It's not anywhere near 100%. And if this is supposed to be the primary burn site, so this is where you begin to realize the state is being disingenuous or dishonest in its representation of the burn pit, the bones, and everything else, because it doesn't look good, and it makes it look even worse when they collect it the way they did, without telling anybody, like their lead crime scene technician, to come over and so that they could take pictures and document it like you would normally do, right? Instead of doing that, they start digging it up, collecting it, doing things or whatever, throwing it in boxes, and then the first time that the lead crime scene tech gets to see it, this is where it's at. Some bones are in a box. There's people digging the scene up. There's no reason to take pictures at that point. Then add this. In a recent interview Kratz did, where he talked to somebody on Reddit who believes Stephen and Brendan are innocent, goes by the name of AC. AC and Kratz had a little conversation that was recorded for Convicting a Murderer, the documentary that's supposed to come out eventually. That's supposed to tell the story of making a murderer, but from the other side, right? Anyway, we got a little snippet of that interview or that conversation between AC and Kratz. And in that conversation, Kratz at one point says, "What do I?" Because AC is asking, "Why bar the coroner? Why bar the coroner?" To which Kratz says, "What do I need a coroner for? What do I need a coroner for? A coroner just comes in, kicks the body, and says, okay, they're dead." Very cold, callous thing to say to begin with. But what's even more important is just after that, all right, after Kratz said that, and it was put on Twitter, and we all got to see it, right? It was just like a 2.5 minute segment. And in this 2.5 minutes, he said this, right? And so Jerry Buting tweeted out that the Manitowoc County coroner that was barred from the scene, one of the people that were coming with her was a forensic anthropologist. Do you know the state never called one out? Never. Not anywhere on the salvage yard or the quarry. They claim that that's what they needed so bad, but never called one out. Okay? Didn't make their lead crime scene tech aware that they had found bones over by the burn pit. Didn't tell him until they wanted him to bring his sifting equipment. So, that's, that puts a whole big question around the collection of these bones. And it's like, it makes me wonder. And this, I ask myself this a lot when I'm, researching this case and talking about this case. I ask myself this a lot. What would have caused the state to want to make the decision to collect these bones the way they did? Where they didn't properly document it, they just hastily dug stuff up, sifted, threw it into boxes, and shipped it to Madison so that when their forensic anthropologist got back from vacation, she could start looking at the bones in the box. With no knowledge of where they were found or anything like that to help her. They just ship her a box of bones with no accompanying information, or very little accompanying information. Why would they choose to do it that way? What would they be looking to avoid that they thought doing that would be a better option? That's kind of a question that I continually ask myself when I see the state doing these things. I have to sit there and try to work it out. What were they trying to hide here to think that was the better option or the better way to go? Right? And it happens a lot in this case. So, I'm going to show you right now the tweet from Jerry Buting so you can see that the coroner who was actually barred from the salvage yard, who this was in her jurisdiction, but she was barred from the salvage yard, was bringing a forensic anthropologist with her. Unbelievable. But okay, so this is a tweet from Jerry Buting where he's talking about Ken in an interview that he was, in a conversation that he had with one of the Redditors who believes that Steven and Brendan are innocent. He mentioned about coroners kicking bodies and what do I need a coroner for and those sort of things, but then also said I need a forensic anthropologist. So here's Jerry Buting just calling him out on his BS real quick. He's like, KK is blowing smoke out his ass again. The state never called any forensic anthropologist to the quarry or to Avery salvage yard. They shipped Eisenberg a box of bones to Madison. Coroner Kakich assembled a team, including a forensic anthropologist, to go to the scene, but they barred her from the scene. So, that's, like I said, the very strange nature of the way that they are acting in regards to these bones in every way. It's just bizarre to observe. Okay. So, these are a lot of the strange things that are happening around the collection of the bones. Just the collection. That's what we've gone over right now, is just the collecting of those bones. And the handling and those sort of things. And you can see there's some significant questions there. For instance, if what you needed was an anthropologist, why did you bar the person bringing one? Why was your crime scene technician an afterthought when you found cremains? Why was he not the first thing on your mind? Right? I mean, why would you start digging it up yourself? You know? It's not like, you know, deputies are archaeologists. You know, they may know how to dig with a shovel, but they don't know how to do it properly, safely, whatever, for collection purposes. I mean, that's just not in their, you know, job description, right? So, it's bizarre to me that they didn't immediately get their lead crime scene technician involved. It's just bizarre. So, that brings us to the fact that in 2011, something happened. Okay? Now, you'll remember, I said that prior to trial, Leslie Eisenberg had been classifying the bones found over in the quarry, two properties over, essentially, in what's called the Manitowoc County gravel pit. Okay? The bones found there were... Leslie Eisenberg was actually thinking many of them were human, or at least possible human, and the pelvic bone that was found over there. But the pelvic bone wasn't burned, or it wasn't burned very much. Essentially, it was mostly clean and unburned, right? But the other bones besides the pelvic bone were burned, and at trial, Dean and Jerry are talking about those bones because they've read Leslie Eisenberg's reports prior to trial. Okay? And so they're asking about those and everything, and Fallon's constantly objecting when they're asking their questions about it, and a couple times they have to like reword the way they're questioning it to get to the eventual answer that they're looking to get, you know, at, right? But Fallon is often objecting because he gets quite upset anytime they try to bring up the subject of these bones over in the Manitowoc County gravel pit. It's obvious when you read it through the Eisenberg testimony that, you know, he's objecting quite often when they touch on certain points, particularly with these bones. So what's interesting is that after trial, we clearly see that they have gone back to believing that those bones are human again. And not only human, but that they believe that those bones belong to Teresa Halbach. And we're going to show you why it's obvious that they believe that and in a second. But when Wisconsin has a statute in place. This is where we need to start so that you guys can understand the most recent issue with the bones is that Wisconsin has a statute. This statute protects a prisoner's right to have evidence preserved so that they can hopefully later test it to help prove their innocence if necessary, you know, that sort of thing, right? And so there's a statute, and that means that the state and everything are not allowed to get rid of or destroy any evidence that is from the victim or could prove to be exculpatory in helping to exonerate the prisoner or the convicted person, right? And so there's a statute written to protect it so that it won't be just given away and gotten rid of. Okay? In September of 2011, Deputy Jeremy Hawkins, Investigator Mark Wiegert, Attorney Norm Gahn, who was one of the prosecutors at Steven Avery's trial, and he wrote the said statute that I'm talking about right now, the statute of preserving evidence. He was the one that wrote it. You have the Assistant Attorney General, also a prosecutor on Steven Avery's case, Tom Fallon, and they're all working from Leslie Eisenberg's reports from prior to trial. And they're going through bags of evidence, and they're pulling out all the bones from those bags that Leslie Eisenberg thought were human, or at least thought were human in her early reports. And they are taking those out so that they can be sent to Whiting Funeral Home and eventually go, you know, to be buried and everything like that or whatever. So they're essentially being returned to the family. Okay. The choice of choosing to return these bones to the family is kind of an admission on the state's part that they are Teresa. And therefore, they should have been protected by this statute. And who would know that better than Norm Gahn, the guy that wrote it? All right. So now that I've given you that preliminary base. September 20th, they go through, they give these bones back. But here's what they don't do. According to statute, they are supposed to either... Well, there's 3 ways they can get rid of this evidence, according to statute. Number 1, the prisoner is deceased. Okay, that's one. Steven Avery's still alive, so that one hasn't been met. The prisoner is released. No, Steven Avery's still in prison, so that one hasn't been met. So that only leaves us the 3rd option. That is the option where they have to call or correspond with the prisoner or his attorneys. At the time, Steven had appellate attorneys when this happened. And you're supposed to contact the prisoner or his attorneys and let them know that you're thinking about getting rid of this, and do you guys want to, you know, test it, or, you know, would you guys like to, you know, basically you give them the opportunity to be able to test that evidence and stuff before it's gone forever. Right? Makes sense, right? Giving them at least an opportunity before it's gone forever. I mean, makes sense to me. Well, they didn't do that. They did not make any attempt to let Steven or his counsel know. Not only that, they went even further. The way we found all of this out, by the way, well, I'll tell you in a second. They went even further. Not only did they not correspond or write a letter or call Steven's attorneys or anything, but they hid the investigation reports, the pages of the investigation report. They hid the pages that showed them when they were given these bones back. Those pages were not forwarded to Steven's attorneys so that they would have a complete record. Okay? Neither were the ledgers. The ledgers that itemize exactly when all these bones went into evidence, when they moved around, when they went out for testing, and blah, 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 and then when they were eventually released to go to Whiting Funeral Home. There's a ledger there's ledgers that show all of this. It was not turned over. All of this stuff was hidden and sat on because they didn't want Steven's counsel to find out what they had done, because they knew it was wrong. Right? Makes sense when you got the guy that wrote it right there. Right? They knew what they were doing was problematic. Yet they were still choosing to do it. Right? Which once again brings me to that question. What is it exactly they were trying to hide that they thought this was the better road? To turn this stuff back over to the family and not tell Steven Avery or his counsel about it in direct violation of statute. Why? How was that the better option? Right? That's just, again, like I said, you find yourself asking that question a lot in this case. Right? Okay. So, I'm going to show you right now that the page of CASO, the final, or the page 1114 that talks about them giving these bones back. So I'm going to show you that right now so that you can see that happens in 2011. It's also, by the way, happening in September, which is about 3 months before Steven actually ends up getting a decision from the Supreme Court, or before he ends up hearing back from the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And so these bones are technically being handed back before Steven has exhausted all of his appeals. Just wanted to point that out. So here we go. Here's page 1114 of CASO, which was not handed over to Steven and his attorneys, which we actually had to make Zellner aware of, and I'll talk about a little bit about that when I come back. Okay, so for those who are just watching this video and haven't actually done a whole lot of research on this case, this is from the Calumet County Sheriff's Office investigation reports for the Steven Avery case. This is page 1114, and it's talking about returned items here. Okay, this report is written by Deputy Jeremy Hawkins. This is all taking place on 9/20 of 2011. So that's basically, September 20th of 2011. And keep in mind that at this point in time right here, Steven was still petitioning the Wisconsin Supreme Court as part of his appeal, his appeal process of his original conviction. So this is actually a few months before he gets a decision from the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So that's just an interesting note. Okay. On 9/20/11, at approximately 9 a.m., I, Deputy Jeremy Hawkins of the Calumet County Sheriff's Department, along with Sergeant Investigator Mark Wiegert of the Calumet County Sheriff's Department, Attorney Thomas Fallon, who is the Wisconsin Assistant Attorney General, he's there, Attorney Norm Gahn, okay, both Fallon and Gahn were both prosecutors at Avery's trial, removed from evidence all property tag numbers that contained human bone. Attorney Gahn and Attorney Fallon viewed the items under the property tags, and along with Dr. Leslie Eisenberg's report, in other words, her reports from before trial, when she was saying some of the quarry bones were human, right? Using one of her reports, and determined which bones could be returned to the Halbach family. And then it proceeds to kind of go through here and talk about the property tags and what they went through and what they were doing. They photographed, they pulled pieces out that they determined were human. And I'm going to leave a video below for you guys to go check out that we did back on December 19th when we broke this story, that the state had given all this back even though Zellner was asking to test it. So I'll go ahead and leave that down below. I'll leave you a timestamp of when we really start to talk about the bones and go into the ledgers and really show all the proof. So I'll leave that down below in the description. So this is basically the state giving these bones back, and these bones, some of these bones that we're talking about here are the ones that Zellner wanted to test, and they were believed to be possibly human bones, and the fact that the state chose to give these bones back to the Halbachs would suggest they believe they are Teresa's cremains. And the fact that they didn't want to talk about that at trial is highly suspect to me. Okay, this is Ken Kratz at trial, and he's basically saying, I'm going to take 20 seconds to talk about, because the best anyone can say is that they are possible human. What does possible human mean? Well, it means we don't know what it is, alright? The best anthropologists in the world don't know what these bones are, and talking about Dr. Eisenberg. And so you can see that at trial they are very dead set against those being Teresa. So what I was saying about we had to actually make Zellner aware of those pages of CASO. You remember I was saying the state had sat on the ledgers that showed what they had done, and they sat on this, or they were suppressing it, and they didn't hand it over to Steven's attorneys at the time. Like I said, didn't call them, didn't notify them like they were supposed to, and then they hid all this stuff. The investigation report didn't send it over to Steven's attorneys, because then, well, which is what they should have done, because it should have become part of their record. That's the record that was eventually moved over and given over to Zellner, right? And those pages weren't there, along with the ledgers that showed them giving these bones back. Those ledgers were also hidden, not handed over. So Zellner didn't see all these, and she asked to test these bones. So the moment she filed her motion to ask if she could test these bones, the bunch of members, there was a bunch of the wrecking crew members were looking into it, and they realized that the bones had already been given back by reading page 1114 of the CASO investigation report there. That's when we ended up finding the ledgers and all this other stuff that shows that they thought these bones were human, and they believed they were Teresa's, and that's why they were giving them back to the family. I mean, it shows clear as day that that's what they believe. And they're using a report, okay? You gotta think about this. The two of the three prosecutors of this case, one of them being the Assistant Attorney General of Wisconsin, are there. And they were the prosecutors in this case. And they are using one of Dr. Leslie Eisenberg's early reports where she thought some of these bones were human. You know why she thought that? Allow me to show you why she thought that. Here. Alright, so this is the part of Leslie Eisenberg's testimony where they're talking about the 13 bone fragments found over in the quarry and the gravel pit. And what's important here is that we find out that all of these bones from all these separate places all have the exact same charring and calcine, partial calcination, basically. Okay, but 13 bone fragments were burned. Correct, she says. The charring and partial calcined condition that you saw was essentially consistent with the charring and the calcined condition that you saw in the human bone fragments from the Yonda burn barrel and behind Steven Avery's garage. That is correct, sir. So that is one reason why these bones are such a big deal, because it looks like they started out in the same fire as all the other bones that they believe are Teresa's. And it's just silly to think that if Steven Avery did this, that he would have dragged the bones back to his own fire pit to be caught, right? Okay, so Zellner asked to test these bones. We all figure out that they're already gone. They've been given away. And so I did a video and everything, and there was also an Australian supporter by the name of Carol Ann Fitzgerald who also sent this information to KZ and eventually got KZ's attention. So I figured it was impossible that KZ wouldn't have it, but she didn't. And why didn't she have it? It's because the state was hiding it. It wasn't part of her record because the state was hiding it. They knew that what they were doing was wrong, which makes you wonder why they would do it. Why was it so important to get those bones out? What was so important that they would take the risk of violating Steven Avery's due process rights and possibly free him from prison? If they believed he was guilty and they wanted to keep him in, why would they take that risk? Once again, why is it they keep making these decisions where a very ridiculous option seems to be the one they're going with? What are they avoiding to have that kind of logic? That's seriously the question I'm left with over and over again with this case. And so Zellner then becomes aware she's missing pages and missing things from her record, so she seeks to correct that and seeks to remedy that. Starts making the FOIA request, making sure she gets everything. And then she writes a new motion. Instead of this time, she's not asking for testing. This time, she's motioning that Steven Avery's due process right, the Wisconsin statute was violated, and that the state tried to hide what they had done, and that altogether this violates Steven Avery's due process rights, and various and all that sort of stuff. And that's what's currently going on with Steven's case. There was just a decision from Judge Sukowitz in the circuit court where she denied it, of course, like we all expected her to do. And now Steven's the whole thing with the bones and everything the games the state was playing there, that's all now going and becoming part of Steven's appeal. And now that appeal will move forward now with the added stuff from the bones. And that's what's just going on in this case. It's just bizarre when you look around at the things the state is doing. I swear, I'm not kidding. You gotta ask yourself when you're looking at this stuff, why would they have chosen this option? Why was this the more agreeable option instead of just doing it right or proper, so there could be no question, right? It's like over and over again you're asking yourself that with this case. Alright. Last thing we're going to show you. I mentioned the tooth earlier. Remember? Talked about the forensic dentist that came in and glued two pieces of tooth together and said that it matched Teresa's, and that was part of the evidence against Steven Avery, identifying the remains of Teresa Halbach in his burn pit, right? Okay. I'm going to show you right now something that was made of me, that I was made aware of by 7 Pairs of Panties on Reddit. When she was on Mammothon, when we did Mammothon recently, got the Mammothon tie here, right here. But when she was on Mammothon with me, she brought this Imgur, it's just a snippet of video where they show Teresa's X-ray of her, from her dental records, and then they show an X-ray overlay of the tooth that was glued back together by the forensic dentist. And I'm going to show you it right now. And my reason for showing you this is not so much to convince you that it's not Teresa in the fire pit. My reason for showing you this is to show you that experts for the state, in this case, don't always tell the truth. And it's kind of, when you look at this, you're going to see how obvious that is. Okay? But because they're an expert, if nobody seriously questions it, then nothing happens. But this expert claimed that he glued this tooth back together and that it matched one of Teresa's teeth. And you're going to see right here, right now, when they do the overlay. And then, well, we'll come back and talk about it after. Okay, that's Teresa's tooth. This is an overlay of the tooth. You can see that they don't exactly match, right? Okay, so the burgundy color is actual X-ray of Teresa's tooth, and the kind of yellow or orange, whatever you might want to call that, that is actually the tooth that was glued back together by the forensic dentist that he says matches. Now, I think a lot of you can see here that there is a lot of places where the tooth that was in the fire pit and recovered it grew. It's like it got bigger. It gained mass in a fire. How many people believe that's possible? Because it's not. And you can see that this tooth is wider in a lot of ways than the other one, and these roots are longer. Okay? It's like I said, a tooth isn't going to gain mass in a fire. And that's what it would have had to do here, because it's clearly not the same shape here. So something to point out. And that leaves us with the capper here on this entire situation, because for those of you who may have been following along with Brendan when he was going through his habeas plight and everything, and he was making his way through the system and was almost free, you may have noticed that the state would constantly, whenever they were agents of the state, like Brad Schimmel or anybody, or Ken Kratz or anybody, when they were faced with questions, uncomfortable questions about Brendan that they didn't like or want to answer really, or anything like that, they would immediately say, no, because of the hall box. We care about the hall box. It's all about the hall box, and so I can only take into account their wishes or whatever, right? Whenever they were faced with a difficult question about Brendan, and they would do that over and over and over and over. Now that they're getting called out for a potential due process violation, and because they know what they did by hiding things and everything, they know they're really worried now. And so to try to pull their butts out of the fire, they tried to argue that they didn't actually give Teresa's bones back to the family, that it was just animal bones. I'll leave you with that. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you.